So a little bit of background about Cardiff Rugby Club. It's by no means the oldest. It was founded as Cardiff Football Club in 1876, but it's approaching its 144th year, so it's got quite a provenance. During that history, it's had victories over all the major touring sides, the Springboks, the All Blacks, and I hang my head in shame here, because in doing a talk on Cardiff Rugby, I've made an error. We've played Australia 6 times and beaten Australia 6 times, not 5, as it says there. Hugely embarrassing. Welsh champions, lots of occasions, Welsh Cup winners a number of occasions, produced over 370 international players and 73 British Lions, which is a record for any rugby club. And you'll see that modestly, when we published our centenary history, we declared ourselves to be the greatest. I think people will disagree with that potentially, but probably they would concur that if we're not the greatest, we're certainly one of the greatest rugby clubs, not just in Britain, I think, but in the world. Looking after the history of Cardiff is not new. The first steps in producing a museum go back to 1951. But those are pretty primitive, really, and it was essentially no more than a couple of display cases in a clubhouse. So it was just the very start of bringing a collection together. But in 1969, that collection had its own home, again in the clubhouse, in a place called the Hubert Room, named after a former president. And that rapidly became the depository for some fantastic memorabilia throughout all of the club's history. Now, critically, I don't want to bore you too much with this, but in 2003, Welsh Rugby made a big decision, and that was to move away from club-based structures to what was called regional structures. And in part, that was a response to the advent of professionalism in rugby union. What that meant, though, is that we saw a new, inverted commas, side called Cardiff Blues formed. And I think it's fair to say that 16 years later, we're still trying to actually define what regional rugby is. And when people can't define what they are, sometimes they define themselves by saying what they're not. And what Cardiff Blues certainly weren't was Cardiff Rugby Club. They tried to separate themselves from that past. And that obviously was a risk, because it meant that the history and heritage, everything that had been collected, was now being pushed very much into the background. And I think, as you'll see, arguably neglected. So our organisation was founded in 2016. We do lots of different things, but preservation of heritage is central to our mission statement. And we have a strapline which says protecting the past, embracing the future. So going back to Victoria's kind of presentation, and I'm trying to be snappy about what we do. And we began to look at the condition and the state that the collection was in. And that led to the Rugby Club actually setting up its own heritage committee. And those two things together, if you like, began to shine a light again on the heritage artifacts that we have. Not literally, you wouldn't do that in museum terms, but in attention terms. So where were we? We clearly had a collection which is of great significance, not just in terms of Cardiff Rugby, but in terms of Welsh Rugby and in terms of other nations' rugby. And we knew from following the auctions and so on that what we had was of very significant value. Unfortunately, most of it had been on permanent display for many, many decades. Some of it probably for 100 years. And stored in a room where temperature, humidity and light levels varied massively throughout the day, throughout the year. So if you have a collection, you want to age it, make it look a bit more authentic, come and see us. Okay? We have the perfect room to make your collection look a bit more authentic. There was no record. There was no record of the collection. It wasn't insured. And importantly, it was inaccessible in that the room in which it was stored was essentially the domain of committee men. So the ordinary fan, the ordinary supporter never actually got to see it. And all this was against the background that I've mentioned, really, where the heritage of the club was being sort of distanced, pushed into the background. So what do we do about it?
This is us working in the room. My day job is working in museum documentation, so I excited everybody by telling them that the first thing we needed to do was a complete inventory of the collection. Not only was it stored in that room that you can see there, but it was scattered throughout a number of different committee rooms and shamefully in bags in cupboards and goodness knows what. So we started off by doing the inventory so we could get a really good grasp of what we actually had in the collection. We recorded the core information for all of this, of all of our items. We gave everything a unique number, a name, a category, a brief description, and we said where it was located within the club. We then did a little snapshot photograph of absolutely everything, because when we did that first trawl, we didn't always get all of the detail and we couldn't always tell one item from another, so we could go back to the photographs. We then went to Cardiff Athletic Club and showed them the work that we had done and what still needed to be done. And we secured funding from them to get some decent storage materials and to do some proper photography of our historic photographic collections, which are also amazing and just sitting on the walls in constant daylight. We also managed to get a valuation done and sort out insurance with help from Cardiff Blues. And that was the first time really that Cardiff Athletic Club, the old Cardiff Club, and Cardiff Blues acknowledged that they were both owners of this heritage and that they were both willing to help us with it. We then worked with Amgueddfa Cymru, National Museum Wales, to undertake high-resolution digitisation of all of our old team photographs, which date back to the late 1800s. We're about a third of the way through that project at the moment, and it's really interesting. One of the first things we did when we started looking at these collections was to do a condition assessment of the whole collection. I was very lucky in that I had connections with the Conservation Department at Cardiff University. We put an advert out there for conservation students who might be interested in doing some volunteer work with us. And we got 3 women postgrad students who were all fantastic. They knew nothing about rugby, not at the start anyway. We bored them to death during the project. They were quite knowledgeable by the end, I think. And we worked with them to assess the state of the collections. And the sad truth was, as David has mentioned, these things had been on near permanent display in not great conditions. And we had to accept that many of these items needed to come off display. This caused a huge commotion among the committee members, as you can imagine. But I think we won the case that we couldn't just think about them and what they wanted on display. They had to think about their children and their grandchildren and what other generations would also want to be seeing. And in all fairness, we got the money to purchase archival boxes from Glamorgan Archive. You can see the ones down in the corner there were specifically made to fit caps, rugby caps. We had the larger boxes there. It allowed us to pack away our oldest and most fragile international jerseys and Cardiff jerseys. And then we moved all of our fragile objects into secure storage at the Welsh Rugby Union. We were very lucky that they allowed us to store our items there. We then went about improving the displays, which had become a real mishmash over the years. They had become a bit of a dumping ground, to be honest, and there was no rhyme or reason to the displays. It was just wherever there was a space, they'd open up the case and stick something in, and things were just, and it hadn't been cleaned in such a long time. So we took everything out. We cleaned all the cases, we cleaned the photographs, and we didn't do a lot with the fabric. We left the fabric alone because that is a very specialised job. We checked it for insects, but apart from that, we left it. We did unpin the jerseys from felt case linings, which were doing them no favours. And we were very lucky that we got some new mannequins from a local department store as well, who had actually done a lot of the set dressing 50 years ago when the cases were first put in. We also made padded hangers so that the jerseys would hang much better and not be constantly damaged. We tried to improve the lighting and limit the exposure to sunlight, but there was very limited amount that we could do with that. And then we cleaned everything before putting it back on display. Obviously, because we'd had to put a lot of stuff into storage, it left gaps in the collection. So we sent out an appeal to fans and former players to see if we could get loans to replace some of the objects that had been taken off display. And we had a really good response to that. So then before we just dumped everything back on display, we thought long and hard about how we were going to thematically approach it. We had limited resources, limited amount of space, but we wanted to do a thematic approach where the first case would be the earliest history of Cardiff, going on to the sort of classic 1970s eras, and then moving around through all of our international collections and ending up actually bringing Cardiff Blues material for the first time ever into the trophy room. And again, caused a bit of a commotion, but we got it through. And the finished result, it's still a work in progress, but we think we've made it look a lot better and preserved it for the future. That's our sort of 1950s, 1970s Cardiff collection. And you can see our wonderful collection of British Lions jerseys here. We've got Sam Warburton's one from when he captained in the last British Lions tour. We've got Cardiff Blues jerseys from our latest victories, and we've got all the trophies in there as well. So I'm hoping you agree with me that it looks a little bit better than it.
So, as mentioned, we catalogued the collection, and to do this, we were lucky that we had a CF10 trust member who's an expert in creating content management systems. So he built a bespoke one for us, which you can see part of here. The whole thing is probably 5 times the length of that in terms of the data we can capture for any object. So now that we had all this data and we'd taken a lot of things off for display, we thought, well, we need to make a website so that people can see the stuff. Because of the CMS we had, we were lucky that we could just essentially build a website out of it. But it's very important to stress that the database we created serves 2 purposes. We kept all the museum information. We thought that was very important for the future. When we initially catalogued the collection, there were probably 700 objects, I think, roughly, that were physical objects in the collection. Once we'd done that, we've discovered that people were offering us stuff to put on the website to expand the collection, to incorporate the history. So we've now more than doubled the objects on the collection on the website to 1,500. And we've also now added things like documents of all the season reports and season results. So now the collection is collection objects, documents, and virtual objects. I think it's talking about the data that you have for your archive. I thought this was difficult, but we managed to find lots of ways for people to navigate around the website to be able to find things. So we have things like categories, seasons, keywords, recently added and updated, so people can go back again and see what we've changed. Our latest things that we've put on are, we've now got an article section, so we've got some people who are writing us some lovely articles that relate to objects, and our new flagship, the oral histories. Some we might recognise the chap there, who we've recently interviewed. But I think the important thing is that we had a stagnating collection in our trophy room that nobody ever saw, and as well as rescuing it physically by putting it on the website, we've exposed the collection to many more people and given the collection resilience by adding new stuff to it.
So I think what we have done, I think, fits very much with the resilience theme, and I think, you know, the team's been mentioned several times, and we've just been really lucky with the people that we've had on board. It's made life so much easier. We've literally stopped the raft, and I think raised the profile of the collection through the online facility. But to me, this is actually the most important thing. We've made it accessible, and we regularly open the trophy room several times a year so that the ordinary fan can come in. And people will be sort of saying, you know, I've been coming here 40 years and I've never been in this room. So I think that in itself is a massive step. It's a living museum, as Sal says. And the long-term plan actually is for Cardiff Arms Park to be redeveloped. And we have outline agreement for there to be a museum site, a proper museum site within that kind of scheme. So fingers crossed. We've been waiting about 10 years so far, so we're not overly optimistic, but that's the plan. Thank you.